as Pike County, Alabama's probate judge, which is the county's senior election official. He was then elected to the Alabama House of Representatives, where he served as the vice chair of the legislature's Constitution, Campaigns, and Election Committees. I know that Secretary Allen is honored to appear before this committee and offer his knowledge on matters, as he's made it his mission to make it easy to vote in safe and secure elections. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. If the witnesses would now please stand and raise their right hand. Do you swear that the testimony, give you a second. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. You will now proceed, and we'll recognize you each for a 5-minute statement, starting with Secretary Benson. And Senator, I will leave to vote for a little bit at some point, so thanks. Secretary Benson.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Fisher, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be joining you today for this important hearing. These next 8 months will define the future of our country and our democracy. And as Michigan's Chief Election Officer, that reality is clear to me every day, both as we work to ensure our elections are safe and secure, and in our efforts to protect every voter and every election official from the lies, threats, and deceptive tactics that continue to plague our democracy. It's been a challenging few years for us, yet our democracy is getting stronger. First, voter turnout is on the rise. From 2020, when we saw more citizens vote than ever before, to 2022, when Michigan led the nation in youth vote turnout, citizens are engaged and they are voting. Second, the number of ways voters can participate in our elections continue to expand, from the right to vote from home to early voting to traditional election day voting places. Michigan's experience underscores that the expansion of options to vote directly leads to higher voter participation across the political spectrum in every election. But as the Chief Elections Officer of a battleground state, I know these successes do not tell the whole story. We go into this election cycle expecting bad actors to use misinformation, turbocharged through AI, to divide, deceive, and deter voter participation throughout our country. I'm not just talking about deepfakes. AI will also make it easier to mislead voters about the voting process or even conditions at a polling place. Imagine a voter receiving a text warning saying there's long lines at a precinct, and not to go, or another seeing a social media post showing a polling location changing because of flooding. All of these could be false, and all of these could deter participation. The realities of AI underscore the need for federal investment in our elections. AI introduces a level of speed, scale, and sophistication that is difficult for under-resourced state agencies to handle on our own. Federal funds help us to support and bolster our state cybersecurity infrastructure and do more voter education to address this evolving threat. We also need the Department of Homeland Security and CISA to be more aggressive in identifying and combating threats and in notifying local officials and states with critical security information, helping us ensure voters know what to do when they encounter deceptive election practices. At the state level in Michigan, we are doing our part. We've enacted laws to require disclaimers and disclosure of political advertisements generated with AI, and we've made it a crime for anyone to knowingly and deceptively distribute AI-generated deepfakes. But now we need you to do your part. As U.S. Senators, you can protect every voter in this country from the harmful effects of deceptive AI-generated content by passing the Protect Elections and Deceptive AI Act. Finally, we cannot have a secure democracy if we do not protect the security of the people who protect our democracy. Our job as election administrators increasingly forces us to endure harassment, false and malicious attacks on our character, and threats of violence, all because of lies about our work and our integrity. On a morning walk throughout her neighborhood, Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey was approached by a man who told her, "You are going to pay dearly for your actions in this election." Oakland County Elections Director Joe Rozelle was recently threatened that he would be hanged for treason. Former Rochester Hills Clerk Tina Barton received a voicemail saying 10 million patriots will surround you when you least expect it, and that she deserved a knife to the throat. These are just a few examples of what our election administrators endure. And as misinformation increases, so do the threats. We all have a duty to protect the people who protect democracy. In Michigan, we've made it a state crime to threaten or intimidate an election official with the specific intent of interfering with the official's duties. This should be a federal crime. Election officials are professionals. We are nonpartisan. We put voters first, and we are firmly committed to ensuring every citizen can have rightly placed faith in their vote and in our elections. It should be your highest priority to ensure we have the funding, the resources, and the legal protections to make democracy work for everyone, because ensuring our security is critical to ensuring election security. I've spent my career defending the right to vote of every eligible citizen. That commitment has never wavered, and it will not waver now. I'm here today to ask you all to share that commitment and help us ensure we are protected so that our democracy continues to thrive this year and every year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Allen.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about election security. As Alabama Secretary of State, I serve as the state's chief elections official and work closely with the probate judges, circuit clerks, sheriffs, absentee election managers, poll workers, boards of registrars, who are all an integral part of our elections process at the local level in each of our 67 counties. When I took the oath of office 14 months ago, I made it a top priority to ensure that our elections are fair and secure so that every eligible voter who wishes to cast a vote in any election in our state could do so with confidence, knowing that their vote would be properly counted. Elections are the bedrock of our constitutional republic, and it is my constitutional duty to ensure our elections are conducted with integrity, honesty, and accuracy. Voter registration and voter file maintenance are the foundation of election integrity. Registered voters can choose to participate in elections in Alabama with the confidence that our elections process is fair and secure because Alabama has taken steps, solid steps, in our state to ensure election integrity. We have enacted legislation in Alabama that makes it illegal for any voting tabulator to be connected to the internet. Alabama state law requires the use of paper ballots in all elections. Each of our voters must verify their identity with photo identification at his or her polling place. If a voter does not have a valid photo ID for voting purposes, my office will send someone to the location of their choice, even their home, to issue them a voter ID upon request. Proper voter file maintenance is essential in instilling and preserving confidence in elections. Just this year, I, with the help of the dedicated team of the Office of Secretary of State, established the Alabama Voter Integrity Database, AVID. For the first time in our state's history, we have been approved to directly cross-check our voter file with the National Death Master Index maintained by the Social Security Administration, so that when an Alabama voter dies in another state, we are able to identify and remove that individual from our voter file. Quickly removing a deceased Alabamian from our voter file not only instills confidence, but also allows us to maintain a more accurate voter file. Every state should be able to do this, but excessive federal regulations make it more difficult than it should be for states to access this important information. You, as members of the United States Senate, can remove these obstacles and make this information immediately available to every Secretary of State in the country. AVID also enables us to work with the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency to receive notifications of Alabama licensed drivers over the age of 18 who have received a driver's license in another state. Additionally, by comparing the National Change of Address database maintained by the United States Postal Service to our voter file, we identified registered Alabama voters who have requested to have their mail forwarded due to moving to a location outside of the state. For the first time in our state's history, we have entered into agreements with each of our border states, allowing us to identify people who are registered to vote in Alabama and in a border state. Voters who are identified as possibly relocating through any of these methods receive a mailer from their county boards of registrar, asking them to confirm their relocation or update their Alabama voter registration information. To date, we have, through AVID, identified 109,709 Alabama voters who have likely relocated outside of the state. But unlike deceased voters, we cannot quickly remove them from the Alabama voter file. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the NVRA, mandates that we wait 4 years to make such removal. If I can make a recommendation to this body to increase confidence in our elections, it would be to shorten the 4-year waiting period mandated by the NVRA, especially considering the fact that state-to-state movers account for 19.9% of all relocations according to the U.S. Census Bureau. The 4-year waiting period allows an individual to remain in a voter file in a state in which they no longer live for several elections, including a presidential election, a U.S. Senate election, a gubernatorial election, 2 congressional elections, and numerous local elections. 4 years, quite frankly, is too long. This federal law requires secretaries of state to knowingly maintain bloated, inaccurate voter lists. Amending the NVRA to shorten the 4-year waiting period would certainly increase voter confidence, decrease bloated voter files, and result in more accurate voter files across the country. Again, thank you for your time. It's been an honor and a privilege to appear before you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Mr. Kramer.
Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Fisher, and members of the committee, I want to thank you for having me here today. As was mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Charleston County Board of Elections, but also have the privilege of serving as the Vice Chair of the Election Subcommittee for the National Association of Counties and as a member of the United States Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors. I cannot overstate the significance of the county perspective in any topic involving election administration. We are the frontline workers responsible for ensuring smooth elections nationwide. Administering elections in Charleston County is a responsibility I hold with the utmost seriousness. But my journey is also very personal to me. It's rooted in my mother's dream of becoming a U.S. citizen when I was a child. Witnessing her exercise her right to vote left a permanent mark on my life, igniting in me a passion for politics and then election administration. I am here testifying before you because of her hard work and determination. And as we stand on the threshold of another crucial election cycle, it is important for us as election administrators to draw from the lessons of the past to strengthen the foundation of our democracy for the future. When we reflect on the preparations for this upcoming year, in Charleston County, our main concerns revolve around 3 pivotal needs, and these are crucial: the protection of election officials, the security of our polling places, and the assurance of adequate federal funding. The safety and well-being of our election personnel is at the heart of our operational concerns. During the June 2022 primaries, our polling places became battlegrounds for these disruptive elements to the democratic process. A local group traveled to each polling place on election day. They harassed our poll workers. They claimed we were breaking the law. And at several locations, they actually called law enforcement to arrest our poll workers. Just to be clear, South Carolina law does not allow us to have law enforcement enter a polling place unless they've been summoned by the majority of poll workers. And then one of the leaders on social media posted this: "For all of you on the team tomorrow observing the polls, good hunting. You know what you're looking for. We have the enemy on their back foot. Press the attack forward." The enemies he's referring to were his neighbors. Good people who are just trying to carry out the duty, their civic duty of the democratic process. And as our lead poll manager returned on that night, many of them expressed to me personally they felt unsafe. I believe Charleston County can be a model, though, for other election officials across the country trying to see how they can make their polling places safe and their voters safe. Our office meets monthly with our counter threat manager, our local law enforcement, emergency management, and public safety. Together, we are enhancing our training for active shooters, also how to mitigate any disturbance at the polls, and how to communicate in highly stressful situations. We hosted our first ever election security workshop last year, and we created a law enforcement guide that we give to all our law enforcement partners so they know what they do if they get a call on election day. Charleston County has made substantial investments to the election process through building upgrades, surveillance systems, and also giving us access control mechanisms that are imperative to mitigate any potential threats in our election operations. However, I want to say this clear: not every county can make similar investments. Numerous counties in South Carolina, rural and urban, need an infusion of federal funds to improve the security of their election infrastructure, and that's very vital to the security of our elections. South Carolina is one of several states that does not pass HAVA grant money to the county level. This needs to change. Congress needs to give us the ability, the counties, those funds, so we can have a direct access because we are the ones who run elections day to day. This year, we have a huge effort to recruit the next generation of poll workers, as many of them have left due to threats and harassment. To demonstrate that it's possible that counties can apply directly for funding, the EAC awarded $1 million to support the Help America Vote College program. Charleston County applied and received $76,000 for an innovative program aimed at recruiting college students to serve as poll workers. In addition, we have created the Day for Democracy program, which allows county employees to serve on Election Day. County employees who participate, they also get poll worker pay on top of administrative leave with pay. Over 15% of our poll workers in 2023 were county employees. Having trusted public officials serving as poll workers greatly boosts public trust in the election process. And many of our poll workers remember a day when elections were simple. They now have become more complex, the stakes have never been higher, and we need Congress's help. You can pass Senator Klobuchar's Election Worker Protection Act or other proposals that will strengthen election worker safety. Also, we must impose penalties on anyone who would threaten, pressure, or dox election officials. Without increased funding and action to protect election workers, counties will continue to see increased resignations of career election officials and struggle to recruit and retain seasonal poll workers. In South Carolina, over 70% of election directors have left their posts since 2020. And I'm often asked, why am I still in this profession? It's really a simple answer for me. I believe in the United States of America and the freedoms we enjoy. I'm able to serve this great country by providing the mechanism by which our country was founded, the ability to give everyone a voice in shaping the future and direction of our country through voting. Election administrators need the support of Congress now more than ever to protect and fund our elections.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Cruz.
Chairwoman Klobuchar and Ranking Member Fisher, I appreciate the invitation before the committee this afternoon. My name is Brian Kruse. I'm the Douglas County Election Commissioner. One of the most important aspects of election administration is trust and fairness in conducting and managing elections. In Nebraska, we have the gold standard for election administration. First and foremost, we use paper ballots. Voters receive a paper ballot, whether it be for early voting or election day voting. The tabulating machines that count ballots are never connected to the internet or to each other, and these machines are used only after numerous pre-election tests. Following the election and before results are official, a thorough canvass or audit process is conducted, as well as a manual audit directed by the Nebraska Secretary of State's office. There is a paper trail. Our office prepares for election cycle by reviewing and updating procedures for each department to ensure that each voter registration, candidate filing, early voting request, ballot, or petition signature is processed according to the statutes and using consistent rules and guidelines. When processing thousands of records and training seasonal staff, it is important to ensure that correct procedures are being followed. Early voting by mail can be secure and accurate method of voting if administered properly. For polling place elections, Nebraska law requires voters in the majority of counties who choose to vote by mail to request an early voting or absentee ballot prior to each election, as ballots cannot automatically be sent. Signatures and now voter ID requirements are checked at the time of each request is processed. If these requirements are not met, a ballot will not be sent. Upon ballots being returned, signatures are checked again. Drop boxes in Douglas County are secure under 24/7 surveillance cameras and emptied each day by 2 individuals of differing parties. I encourage voters to use one of our drop boxes as they are the most direct way to return election mail. The voter places the item in the box and election workers pick them up. There are no third parties involved. Voters in Douglas County across all political spectrums have embraced the drop boxes. On average, 77% of all by-mail ballots are returned via one of our drop boxes. Bolstering public confidence in our elections is vital to successful elections. Local election officials are the trusted source for getting the message out about elections. I am fortunate and grateful that I have a good relationship with the local media, TV, radio, and print, as they assist my office in disseminating accurate and timely information. The big task this election cycle for Nebraska is the implementation of voter ID and making sure voters know what is needed both for by-mail early voting and election day voting in order for their ballot to be accepted and their voices to be heard. The media is also a vital partner in reminding voters of deadlines and other helpful guides to make the process successful. For instance, working with our office to create an infographic or flowchart of the voter ID options. My Chief Deputy Election Commissioner and myself attend as many community events as possible to provide election education, answer questions, and build relationships. These relationships have forged trust and have been instrumental for my office in correctly informing voters of changes related to elections. In Nebraska, we are also unique in the fact that we have a state law, the only state which allows for poll workers to be drafted, similar to jury duty. Douglas County was the only county in Nebraska that conducted a draft for many years. Some advantages to drafting poll workers are increased community awareness of the election process, less difficulty in securing election workers, and a younger workforce with an average age in the mid-50s, while the majority of poll workers nationwide are over 60. In conclusion, it is my privilege to serve the voters of Douglas County and an honor to be here representing the 93 county election officials in Nebraska who work diligently to conduct accurate elections. I encourage all citizens from coast to coast to go and have your voices heard on Election Day. Thank you for inviting me today, Senator Fisher, and thank you to the committee for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cruz. Ms. Nelson.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Fisher, and committee members. My name is Janai Nelson. I'm the President and Director-Counsel of LDF, formerly the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the state of voting rights for Black Americans, both on the ground and in the courts, and about the urgent need for congressional action to protect and secure the fundamental freedom to vote. My testimony is informed by LDF's extensive experience over 80 years protecting and advancing voting rights for Black Americans since our founding by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. My testimony is also informed by the on-the-ground election protection work we must do every election cycle in order to ensure that Black voters can cast a ballot and have it counted. Last week was the 59th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when patriots like John Lewis were brutally beaten in Selma, Alabama for simply demanding the right to vote. Their courage and action led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the true start of our multiracial democracy. We need Congress to follow in the steps of those foot soldiers with courage and action today. It's been more than a decade since the Shelby County decision where the Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act, and Congress still has yet to act. But in that decade of congressional inaction, states that were previously subject to preclearance have aggressively and systematically trampled on voting rights, especially those of Black citizens. Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, and other states with histories of discrimination advanced harsh voting restrictions within days, even hours, of the Shelby decision, and a wave of voter suppression laws followed across the country. More recently, the big lie and other myths to undermine faith in our elections have stoked a backlash against voters of color. Some states have targeted the precise pathways to the polls that Black voters have used in recent years, whether it's eliminating or limiting drop boxes in Florida, early voting in Georgia, or vote by mail in Texas. Artificial intelligence is being weaponized to advance frivolous mass challenges to registered voters in Georgia, and this is gaining traction through programs like Eagle AI as a nationwide strategy to distort the electorate. The increased use of AI also threatens to turbocharge disinformation campaigns historically targeted at Black voters. Despite decades of progress towards becoming a more inclusive, just, and equal democracy, we're swiftly moving in the opposite direction. In Alabama, Black and white voter turnout was nearly equal in 2012. But a decade after Shelby, Black voter turnout now lags nearly 8 percentage points behind white voter turnout. Georgia had the largest racial disparity in turnout in 2022 than at any point in the last decade. And the 2020 redistricting cycle was rife with discrimination. Of the 9 states previously subject to preclearance, 6, 2/3, have faced lawsuits challenging their maps for racial discrimination. Federal courts have already found in 3 of our recent cases, Alabama, South Carolina, and Louisiana, that the states created racially discriminatory districting maps, congressional maps. So let's be clear. While LDF is fighting in the courts along with our other civil rights sisters and brothers, we cannot litigate our way out of this problem. But Congress can legislate. Black Americans are headed into November with a shredded shield. As a result of the Shelby County and Brnovich versus DNC decisions, the Voting Rights Act is a shadow of its former self, precisely when we need strong voting rights protections in the face of rising authoritarianism. Destructive court decisions combined with inaction by Congress have stripped them away. The state of voting rights for Black Americans is tenuous, and that is an urgent crisis for our democracy and for this Congress. The president issued a powerful call to action in last week's State of the Union address, and he named the specific solutions that were reintroduced in both chambers, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, both of which we call on Congress to pass. The right to vote preserves every right that we hold dear. It is an effective, nonviolent means of expressing our will. Protecting the right to vote should not be a matter of partisan politics. It is the duty of all elected officials to honor and protect the sacred act that has enabled them to serve. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nelson. Senator Warner is going to take my spot because he has to leave and is chair of the Intel Committee, so he has some interest in protecting our elections. And then we'll turn it over to Senator Fisher, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for holding this critically important hearing. And I appreciate our panel here. Senator Klobuchar is right. I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Yesterday, we had the worldwide threats briefing from FBI, CIA, ODNI, NSA, all of our intelligence community across the board in law enforcement. They indicate, and I believe that we need more hearings like this, and I appreciate Senator Fisher's involved with this as well, that in many ways, we are potentially less protected as we go into 2024 in terms of the security of our elections than we were during 2020. And that's a pretty stunning fact. And there are 4 reasons why this is the case. And I'm talking about now interference from foreign malign influence. Number 1, a number of our adversaries have seen how cheap and effective it is to interfere in our elections. The template that was laid out by Russia in 2016 was literally pennies on the dollar. And if you're thinking about trying to disrupt, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to use technology to disrupt and undermine another nation state's elections than it is to buy airplanes, submarines, and tanks. Russia continues in not just in our elections, but elections around Europe, around the world, in intervening. China has picked up some of these techniques as well, Iran, other nation states as well. So we have a series of nations, and again, particularly led by Russia, who realizes that interfering in our elections could have dramatic effects on America's position in terms of support of Ukraine. Their interest level is higher, number one. Number two, and this is just the nature of our politics today, Americans on either end of the political agenda have much less faith in many of our institutions, and unfortunately, much less faith in particular in the integrity of our election system. Number three, there was a case, Murtha versus Missouri, that the Fifth Circuit put out a ruling in last July, I think ill-suited, and the Supreme Court is reviewing it now, and while they have put a stay on this, that literally prevents voluntary communication between our government and social media companies. I remember in the aftermath of the 2016 incursion, the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, said repeatedly in public, if the federal government has got evidence of Russians or other entities being on Facebook, please share that with us. Well, in a bipartisan fashion, led by then Chairman Richard Burr, the Intelligence Committee shared that information. And I have to say, all throughout, actually, the Trump administration, and in this case, the Trump administration did right, there was voluntary sharing that went back and forth on a regular basis. So if NSA or CISA found a evidence of foreign malign influence, that could be shared on a voluntary basis with the other companies, and vice versa. As of last July, and literally until about 2 weeks ago, there had been no communication between those social media platforms where a lot of this foreign misinformation, disinformation takes place, and the government. And then finally, and I know the panel has talked about this a bit already, we have the whole new advent of artificial intelligence. AI brings at a scale and speed tools to interfere, misinform, disinform. We all know about deep fakes in terms of our images or our voices. It can happen at a scale and speed in which, and I have a particular appreciation for all of the secretaries of state here, that you guys, there's no way you can keep up with. So I feel it's critically important that we do a better job in a bipartisan fashion of educating the American public that this problem has not gone away, that our adversaries wish us ill. Lord knows we have enough divisions between Americans in terms of our political views that we ought to argue amongst ourselves, and that's appropriate. But to somehow have this overly influenced, amplified, misinformed, disinformed by foreign malign influence is incredibly problematic. I know my clock is about out, but Secretary Benson, if you could just briefly, ERIC was a system that was voluntarily set up, again, by folks from the Trump administration that unfortunately states have exited. You decided in Michigan to come into that system. Could you briefly address, and I thank the ranking member for allowing me to get that question in.
Yes, I want to also address what you were talking about with the threats of misinformation. But yes, Michigan has been a member of ERIC since 2019, and we found it to be a really effective method to collaborate with the current membership is 24 other states as well as Washington, D.C., to ensure, a lot of what my colleague from Alabama was talking about with his state system, that we're actually able to do collaboratively with states around the country quite effectively, increasing the accuracy of our voter rolls through what heretofore has been the most secure and effective bipartisan collaboration of states to protect the integrity of our elections that our election administration system has ever seen. It has been victimized by a lot of misinformation, and I actually want to, which really underscores how lies around our democracy harms the security of our democracy. And as you just said very clearly, and one thing we're not talking enough about is that our foreign adversaries to this country have a greater incentive than ever before in this election cycle threatful to interfere with our elections processes. The way they will interfere with our processes is not through trying to harm our infrastructure. Our elections are secure. We all use paper ballots. We all have audits. We all have several layers of security in place to protect every voice and every vote and ensure every eligible vote and only eligible votes are counted. Where misinformation and where foreign threats will affect our elections aren't just through AI, but are in multiple, multi-scale attempts to fool voters about their rights in an effort to cause confusion and chaos and instill fear, in an effort to deceive voters, to divide us as Americans, and to deter us from believing in our voice and in our votes. In that effort, to combat that effort, we must invest in efforts to educate our citizens, boost trusted messengers from all sectors and all parties, and collaborate more than we ever have before to ensure we are marching forward arms locked to protect every citizen's voice in this election from efforts to fool them about their voice and about their votes. The federal government must be a partner in that effort. CISA must be a collaborative partner in that effort, working with all of us to ensure that we are recognizing what maligns our election system isn't really left or right. It's this foreign interference that could cause every citizen in this country to stop believing, not just in their institutions of government, but in their own voice. And against that, we can all fight proudly, I believe, and we can be successful if we do it together.
Thank you, Senator Warner. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm well aware of the malign activities that we see from our foreign adversaries, but I know that election officials also still worry about infrastructure and still worry about the increase that we see from cybersecurity threats, and whether it's threats to the infrastructure itself or government websites or voter registration databases, the poll books. So Secretary Allen, could you tell us about how Alabama has worked to mitigate potential cybersecurity threats and whether you've encountered any unique challenges in this process and whether you see some of those threats changing over time as well?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. We work very closely with our Office of Informational Technology that oversees our statewide agencies and the backbone of our IT department. We have an in-house IT department as well, but we collaborate with these agencies, with the FBI, with the DHS quite frequently, especially over the last several months, getting prepared for the primary that we had last week, and obviously getting prepared for the runoff coming up in certain parts of Alabama in April, and then to the general election in November. So we have many conversations on cyber. That's one thing we take very seriously. Matter of fact, on election night, we have someone there from our Office of Information Technology, the statewide office. We have someone from our own IT department in our office as unofficial returns come in the evening to make sure if there's ever anything that pops up on our radar that we are able to answer them very, very quickly and to mitigate any kind of potential threats that are out there with us or maybe targeting Alabama. So we work across many platforms to make sure that we're ready to fend off any type of cyber attacks in Alabama.
Thank you. Mr. Cruz, what are some of the unique challenges that local election officials face in mitigating those cybersecurity threats? If you turn your mic on, there you go.
Sorry. You know, the big one, I think, obviously would be the disinformation. If someone were to hack a website of ours and try and change information or results, something of that nature. Also, the AI of impersonating myself, you know, perhaps saying polling place changes or deadline changes, things of that nature. We're fortunate in the fact, or I'm fortunate in the fact, that in Douglas County we have the group called .com, the Douglas Omaha Technology Commission, and it's a joint venture. They really are the experts on technology, cybersecurity, and things of that nature. And so they they provide all of that for me. I also do have two gentlemen in-house in our election system and technology department. They created our website. They maintain our website. So if something were to happen, we hopefully could fix it in-house fairly quickly. We don't contract with a third party for that. We can also change things on it instantly using them to get messages out. You know, I think from the local election official perspective, we hear all the time that voters trust their local election officials, and we hear a lot that we believe maybe there was fraud or misinformation or something in someplace else, but not our jurisdiction. And so really having a trust with your community, with your voters, and with media outlets. So when issues do occur, you can contact them and get the correct information out quickly.
You had talked about in your opening statement about the information that you provide to voters in Douglas County and your good relationship with the media. You also mentioned the post-election audit process, and could you talk a little bit about the benefits of that these audits provide to the voters in your jurisdiction?
Absolutely. So that's administered by the Secretary of State's office. So the morning after the election, the Secretary of State's office randomly picks certain precincts and certain races for counties to audit. Larger counties like myself have 3 of them, but every county has at least 1 in a statewide general. And last time we had the 3 races in the 3 precincts. The races were the congressional race, the governor's race, and then the sheriff's race. And so we had 2,325 votes cast amongst the 3 races in the 3 precincts. We go get the ballots out of the vault. We sit down, we literally then hand tally them, make sure they match up with what the machine count had been, which they did. We were perfect last time. But then that instills confidence in the voters. It's another level of check and balance. It's another level of proof to show that our machines are counting the ballots correctly to not only the voters, but to the workers who work there as well, who are then great ambassadors for our office.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very good. Thank you. Secretary Benson, as you mentioned in your testimony, Michigan implemented in-person early voting during last month's primary. Can you share more information about how you worked with local officials about these and other reforms that expand access to voting and why these efforts are important?
I'm happy to. Thank you, Senator and Chairwoman. I am proud in Michigan that both in 2018 and in 22, voters themselves amended our state constitution to implement automatic voter registration, election day registration, enhanced audits and protections, as well as enhanced opportunities for military and overseas citizens to vote. They also gave every citizen a right to vote from home, a right to have a drop box for every 15,000 voters in our state that is secure and monitored and checked daily, and 9 days of early voting in every statewide election. Our presidential primary held just last month was the first statewide election in which we held early voting, and we found it to be a game changer in how citizens have access to cast their ballot, not just on election day, but in-person voting 2 Saturdays or 2 Sundays or a full week before Election Day can dramatically increase voter engagement and turnout and address the fact that when we look at who's not voting, a lot of the reasons why, according to various surveys and data, is because of inconvenience, because they can't get to the polls in a certain time and a certain day. But expanding the number of election days we have has dramatically given more citizens opportunities to participate and has given more democracy partners opportunities to engage citizens in becoming fully educated and informed voters.
Thank you. I mentioned AI, and we know that we already have misinformation out there and how viral it can go. Ms. Nelson, can you speak briefly on how disinformation targets voters to suppress the vote? number one, and then how AI would make it even easier for disinformation to go viral.
Yes, disinformation is something that is not new to our election system, unfortunately. Black voters in particular have been targeted throughout the time that they've enjoyed the right to vote with information that would mislead them as to where to cast a ballot, whether they were eligible. There have been many barriers based on false information. But with AI, we see those efforts multiplied and exacerbated in extremely dangerous ways. For example, we look at the current practice of doxing. I mean, that's something that harkens back to when Black people would vote in the Jim Crow era, and they would have their names and information broadcast to the community so that they might suffer violent repercussions for exercising their right to vote. Similarly, today, we see doxing and people's information being spread, but now at warp speed across the country into the dark web and permeating some of the most dangerous spaces because of technology. And we also see images being used where you have manipulated images of voters and communities that misrepresent what their choices are. So it's quite dangerous and it's hard to detect, and we certainly need legislation to improve that. But importantly, we need protections for the right to vote to enable voters to cast a ballot that will be counted.
Very good, thank you. Along the same lines, briefly, Mr. Kramer, Senator Collins and I called on the EAC to take action following the fake robocalls in New Hampshire. It voted unanimously to allow state and local officials to use federal funds to combat AI-generated disinformation. Can you talk about efforts from local officials to take this on?
Yes, thank you. I think the first thing is using that example in New Hampshire. We were next in line with the Republican primaries, the Democratic being the first in the nation. It was a little confusing in New Hampshire there, but
Mr. Cruz was ready to, take that on.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
But at the end of the day, the first thing as election officials we do is plan and making sure that our local partners. And one thing I'm very thankful for, we have a counter threat manager in Charleston County who's monitoring all the threats that are coming in across the nation and using that information to then inform our decision-making process. And you have to get everybody on board with this. One of the things with elections, we rely on so many different processes, countywide, municipality-wide, statewide. There's so much overlap that communication is so important. So when we have something going on at the local level, we can push that information to our fusion center, which then goes to the national level. So when it comes to AI and funding specifically, the counties have to have an ability to participate in the application of those funds if they are available, and using those funds proactively to mitigate any AI threats that we would encounter. In Charleston, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, good, thanks. I just want to quick. Mr. Allen, can you talk about how, we work hard to get some federal funding for elections? It's been helpful for equipment and the like. Could you address how the ways your state has been able to put federal election funds to use?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. We used HAVA funds to make available to all of our 67 counties GIS software, mapping software that are able to be used in all of our Board of Registrars' offices. So when they are getting folks registered to vote, or when they are implementing new county commission lines, school board district lines, congressional lines, that the voters are made sure that they are put in their correct voting precinct in the correct district. So we have made that available, and it's being utilized right now, and we are happy and pleased with the implementation of how that's going so far.
Thank you very much. I'll save a question. My colleagues are all here for you, Mr. Cruz, on recruiting poll workers and the like. With that, we turn it over to Senator Britt.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Allen, this committee has heard testimony before regarding nationwide challenges with recruiting and retaining poll workers. I know that earlier this year you launched the Heroes to the Polls initiative in Alabama to help recruit poll workers in our state. Can you explain more about what that initiative is and how it's been implemented and how it's going at this point?
Thank you, Senator. So who better than veterans to protect our elections? They have protected our constitutional right to vote with their service through the military. So we wanted to launch this program to help recruit poll workers. I can tell you, as a former probate judge who stayed on the phone a lot recruiting poll workers, that's one thing we wanted to make available and help our local elected officials who run our elections. And so that's really, really important that we make that available to them. And, we want to give another tool to the probate judges, circuit clerks, and sheriffs. So when they're appointing those election officials, and when I'm speaking to groups, one thing I always try to encourage these groups to do is I ask them, I said, raise your hand if you've ever served as a poll worker. And sometimes you have some, sometimes you don't. And I always encourage them to get involved because that's how they can help their local communities. And so with our Heroes at the Polls program, we think that's important. We've also launched Lawyers for Liberty, which is we work with the Alabama State Bar to give attorneys and to recruit attorneys. If they sign up, get trained, and work on election day, they get 4 hours of continuing education.
Oh, that's
Through the
great.
state bar. So we want to make that tool available to them as well. And so we're taking steps to help these local officials to recruit poll workers.
Excellent. Thank you for your work on that. Additionally, as you know, federal law bans non-citizens from voting in federal elections. That being the case, it's important that states be given the tools that they need to ensure non-citizens are not able to register or vote in our elections. Last year, I introduced the Citizen Ballot Protection Act here in the Senate, and I appreciate all of my Republican colleagues on this committee joining me in that effort. Congressman Gary Palmer of Alabama introduced the House version of that bill earlier last summer, and it was voted out of House Committee on Administration in November. I hope to see both chambers pass this and it become law. The bill is simple. It amends the National Voter Registration Act to allow states to put in place a proof of citizenship requirement for both the federal mail voter registration form and any state mail voter registration form that they might be able to develop. Secretary Allen, in that vein, can you explain what resources secretaries of state have around the country at their disposal to provide their state or local election officials the ability to verify citizenship when individuals attempt to register to vote?
Thank you for the question. The simple answer is we don't have really anything that at our disposal to verify citizenship. Really, when a man or woman goes in to register to vote and they sign their name, they are attesting that they are telling the truth, that they are a citizen of the country. Just recently, back in December, we asked the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services for a list of non-citizens so we could cross-check our voter file in Alabama. We were denied that list from the federal government. They told us to use the SAVE program, which is the Systematic Alien Verification Entitlement Program database. But the thing is, the SAVE program database does not allow states to verify citizenship through that database. So that's really all we have. We tried. The federal government, federal courts have blocked previous efforts by states to verify citizenship. I think it's important now more than ever, especially given what's happening at our southern border.
Are there any other additional barriers that hinder citizenship verification that you can think of, or? Sounds like they're significant as it is.
There are significant challenges to verifying citizenship. We have tried making telephone calls and so forth to federal.
I only have 30 seconds left. Just quickly, you mentioned this in your opening testimony, but you talked about if an Alabama voter needs identification, that you will go to their home free of charge. Can you explain to the committee here the efforts that we make in the state to be able to make that available to every citizen?
Sure. So we require photo identification to vote, but we will give anyone that needs a photo identification to vote in Alabama free of charge. We'll go to their home. If they call and request that, we will go to their house to make sure they have a photo identification. We want every eligible Alabama citizen to be able to vote, Senator.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And Secretary Benson, you had several examples in your testimony of the intimidation of poll workers. And one was election director was threatened to be hanged for treason, and I believe in Rochester Hills, a voicemail saying 10 million patriots will surround you when you least expect it, directed towards Tina Barton. Another in Detroit City saying you're going to pay dearly. This is all across the country. And this is an example of the threats that were put forward in Oregon, being written on the parking lot. And as you can see, it was basically done right after the election. Vote don't work. Translated, elections don't work. Next time, bullets. And I must say, I've been hearing from clerks all over my state that they're having difficulty recruiting poll workers due to these threats, which have basically been inspired by Trump's argument that the election was stolen. Is this happening all over the country?
Yes, and it has since the 2020 election cycle in terms of the threats and the challenges. And my colleagues on this panel have talked about some of the solutions of anti-doxing legislation. And I think Michigan has gone a long way to pass state laws to very clearly draw a line in the sand about what is and isn't appropriate in terms of threats to election workers. I would just add one thing. One, I think the absence of any clarity from the federal government that this is not appropriate and that it is a crime to threaten an election official in their line of official duties is, well, I would say passing a law to clearly make it a crime, and as I know Senator Ossoff and others have proposed, would send a very clear message of support and protection to these individuals who have borne a lot of the brunt of the misinformation and lies and deception that has plagued our democracy for the last several years. The other thing I'll underscore is one thing I'm particularly proud of in Michigan, where we launched the Democracy MVP program in 2020. It too partners with Vote Our Vet to recruit veterans. It too partners with the ABA nationally and in our state to recruit attorneys. What we have seen as a result also is a new generation of election workers step up to the plate, determined to protect our democracy despite the threats, yet at the same time the threats are still.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get in a couple other questions here, but it's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. And Secretary Allen mentioned the importance of making sure that non-citizens don't vote. And this has been a point of some discussion as to whether these strategies are intended to essentially intimidate people and whether this is addressing a real problem. Have you seen a significant number of non-citizens attempting to vote in your state?
No.
And do I recall that Michigan did some audits to try to examine that, and what did those audits find?
Yes, we take the importance of ensuring every eligible vote is counted, and only eligible votes are counted very seriously. We have several layers of protection when we implemented automatic voter registration in particular to ensure documentation and also make clear to folks the consequences, legal consequences of lying on these forms. But at the same time, as we've done our work and done our investigations, we've consistently found that our voter rolls are clean and that non-citizens are not voting to the extent that some would allege.
So there's many ways to approach this that have worked very well. And Ms. Nelson, would you affirm that that is the case?
It's that there are non-citizens attempting to vote in any substantial or even notable number.
Just say, I hate to see people trying to address a non-problem and disguise it as a problem when they're really trying to intimidate people from voting. Ms. Nelson, I wanted to turn to your testimony, and you mentioned in it several things that are done to discourage people from voting, and I've heard about these all across the country. If you have a section of the state that you don't want to vote, like a certain city, a certain poor area, a certain Native Indian reservation, changes in polling location, you move it, you consolidate it, you proceed to open the voting place late. You proceed to understaff it so that there is a long line. You proceed to put the voting place where there's no parking, so people get very frustrated. You proceed to run out of ballots, which was one I hadn't heard about before when you're talking about Mississippi. And so these strategies, how do we tackle these?
Well, the way we're tackling them is we have 25 poll monitors on the ground right now in Mississippi addressing those very issues that you just laid out. I have a real-time email from my team telling me that that's what they're seeing. There's also signage issues. There are many ways that are not easily detectable until you are in the middle of an election and voters are being disenfranchised, where there is a clear targeting and a clear disregard for certain communities when they are attempting to cast a ballot. What we need is, in addition to our election protection efforts, we need strong legislation that will prevent some of these changes from happening without there being some preclearance, some authority that says it is okay for you to do this. It will not disproportionately harm certain voters.
Yeah, I really want to just emphasize that in closing, because these things sound like legitimate operations, moving a polling location and so forth, but they can be used in an extremely prejudicial manner. Thank you.
Very good. Senator Hagerty and then Senator Padilla.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. Your work overseeing our elections is extremely important. The founders tasked the states with conducting elections to help ensure the integrity of and the confidence in our election system. So I wanted you all to know I appreciate your service. Secretary Allen, I'm going to direct all of my questions to you, however, because we have a limited amount of time. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief, yes or no, if appropriate, sort of answers, and let's get started. Are you familiar with President Biden's Executive Order 14019, which directs federal government agencies to engage in voter mobilization, including helping with completing vote-by-mail materials and finding third-party organizations to help provide voter services on federal property?
Yes, sir.
Secretary Allen, are you aware of any authority in federal law that permits the executive branch agencies to engage in this sort of voter mobilization activity?
I'm not.
Nor am I. In fact, it seems like this activity actually may very well violate the Hatch Act. It may violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits spending funds in a manner that's not authorized by Congress. Secretary Allen, does it seem problematic to you for taxpayer-funded federal agencies to, quote, assist applicants in completing vote-by-mail ballot forms and bring in outside organizations to help do that?
Yes, sir, it is problematic.
This Biden executive order says that any outside organizations brought in to help with voter mobilization must be, quote, nonpartisan. Let's take a look at who's helping the Biden administration with this order. Last year, an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services acknowledged that it was working with groups like the ACLU and DEMOS to implement this voting executive order, the latter of which describes its mission as, quote, pioneering bold, progressive ideas. A FOIA request also revealed that DEMOS is working with the Department of Agriculture on this matter. Secretary Allen, do the ACLU and DEMOS sound like nonpartisan groups to you?
No, sir.
No, they obviously aren't nonpartisan. Their priorities are openly partisan. Secretary Allen, if Biden agencies are using openly left-wing groups to conduct get-out-the-vote activity, it sounds like the federal government is being used as an arm of the Biden campaign, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
This is like a Republican administration hiring the Heritage Foundation to engage in, quote, nonpartisan voter mobilization activities. A couple of weeks ago, Vice President Harris announced that the Biden administration was paying college students to reach out to voters and serve as, quote, nonpartisan poll workers. Then the Vice President provided an example of the nonpartisan poll workers that she was talking about. That the person that she gave as an example previously worked for the ACLU and the Alliance for Justice, which is a partisan group. Secretary Allen, does this inspire confidence that the Biden administration's voter activity is nonpartisan?
Doesn't sound like it, sir.
No, it doesn't. One way the Biden administration could alleviate some of this concern is by revealing what they're using these taxpayer dollars to do. Under Executive Order 14019, the Biden administration required each federal agency to come up with a plan for driving voter mobilization and submit that plan to the White House. Yet, the Biden administration refuses to disclose these plans. And that's despite congressional inquiries, that's despite FOIA requests to do so. So, coming back to your experience here, Secretary Allen, is it normal for a president, or even a governor for that matter, to require government agencies to engage in voter mobilization and develop secret plans for doing that and keep that all secret from the public?
I don't think that's normal.
I certainly don't either, and I think it's understandable that many Americans are concerned about these secret taxpayer-funded voter mobilization plans, and the Biden administration needs to release these plans. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get to my questions, Let me just share with my colleagues in the committee and the witnesses in front of us just one of many examples. The exchange I just witnessed fails to point to any partisan language in the directives that were referenced. If anything, I'll call your attention to the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis in 1993. And before we get to the substance of the act, just find under Section 2, findings and purposes, findings that Congress, again on a bipartisan basis, finds that, one, the right of citizens of the United States to vote is a fundamental right. Number 2, it is the duty of the federal, state, and local governments to promote the exercise of that right. And it goes on from there. So for anybody looking for where in statute we might find the opening for the federal government, not on a partisan basis, on a nonpartisan basis, to encourage, actually accept a role and responsibility in encouraging citizens of the United States to exercise their fundamental right to vote. Here's one example. Moving on. I know we can and should have longer-term conversations about modernizing elections and what y'all need to continue to protect the integrity of the bedrock of our democracy. I know that threats to election workers and poll workers has already been covered in this hearing, but recognizing that, look, we're well deep into the primary season of 2024, November's on the horizon. Let's talk about some practical here and now things that can and should be done. Just 2 examples from my home state. At the county level, Santa Clara County, one of the larger counties in my state, hosts an annual media day. Every election has a media day to help inform voters and, the press, and by extension, the public of the voting process. The more understanding there is, the more we can follow the news and maintain faith and confidence in the process. Post-primary, they're now doing the vote counting because it takes a while in California because of the high levels of participation. Statewide, California has implemented a ballot tracking system where people can sign up to receive text messages, email messages in multiple languages, by the way, on the status of their ballot on the way to the voter, on the way back to the county, when it's this process, when it's been counted. Questions for Mr. Kramer. What systems are in place for state and local officials to learn what either federal resources or university resources are available to them, and maybe even a sharing of information systems to share these best practices?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The great honor we have in Charleston County is election sharing with our state partners. We hold a state conference every year, but one thing I'm proud of is we're launching the Voter Ambassador Program in Charleston County, and we are the trusted election information source. And we're going to empower other organizations within Charleston County to be our ambassadors under strict guidelines, but it helps give that official information. So when we do a program like that, we have to be able to share that with other counties and states. The EAC has a great clearinghouse program that we are now being able to tap into, and that is a resource sharing where we can ask questions. What are you doing to be effective in election administration? And it's a tool that I actually applaud the EAC for introducing, and it helps election officials.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, on a very specific topic, recently the Department of Education clarified rules around the federal work-study program, making it clear that, yes, it is legal for students on work-study jobs to work in election offices. I actually encouraged the department to make this clarification last October because somehow it was a question in the minds of some, and I'm glad it happened. I think it's a terrific way to bring dedicated younger Americans into elections offices to see their democracy up close and personal. And imagine being inspired to pursue a career in that area, but in the short term, possibly help alleviate some staffing concerns. Question for Mr. Kramer. You've previously had high school and college-age poll workers and election workers, correct? How have they performed?
They are amazing, and they bring a fresh breath of air to the polling places. Our lead poll workers love when they see high school students and college students participating. And one of the things we see is then they continue serving after they've done it once. And that's the remarkable thing about bringing young kids into the process. And then in South Carolina, you can serve as young as 16. And they get really conflict resolution. They're able to do team building. So this is a really great resume builder, and I look forward to actually working with the College of Charleston. We have the EAC grant money that we're going to introduce some programming through that, so we're excited.
Secretary Benson, is this something you can adopt or expand on in Michigan?
Well, Senator Padilla, you know we're already doing this in Michigan.
Softball. It's called the softball.
But yes, I mean, I'm grateful for my colleague in South Carolina for his leadership, but truly partnerships and make democracy work, and it's a team sport. So, and we welcome, people of all backgrounds, left, right, and in the middle of serving as election workers. It's a great way to see just how secure our system is.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff, and then the ever-patient Senator Butler. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator Butler. Thank you to the panel. Secretary Benson, former president called Georgia's Secretary of State, and this is in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, said, quote, "So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have." You ever gotten a call from a presidential candidate asking you to find precisely the number of votes they need to win the election?
No, I've never gotten a call from any candidate for any race asking for making such an inappropriate request of an election official.
How about you, Secretary Allen? You ever gotten a call from a candidate asking you to find precisely the number of votes they need to win?
I've not received a telephone call.
Strike you as proper?
Excuse me?
Does it strike you as proper?
No, listen, I can only take care of what we have in Alabama.
Simple question. Does it strike you as proper for the President of the United States to call a state Secretary of State and ask them to find the exact number of votes they need to win the state?
I don't know exactly what he meant by finding those votes, but I was not Secretary at the time.
Secretary Allen, does it strike you as proper for the President of the United States to call a state Secretary of State and ask them to find precisely the number of votes they need to win? Yes or no?
I can tell you that as Secretary in Alabama, I'm going to follow the law that Alabama legislature has laid out for me to follow when administering the elections.
Oh, your fear answering that question doesn't inspire confidence. Let me ask you, Secretary Benson, about the intimidation of election workers. You had noted legislation that I'm introducing this week, the Election Worker and Polling Place Protection Act. It would create criminal penalties for threats of violence to intimidate voters or election officials. Appreciate you expressing support for the legislation. What effects do threats on election workers and efforts to intimidate election workers have on election administration?
I mean, not only does it cause us to fear going to work and feel, even though we do important work and do it with pride, that somehow there are people who wish to harm us, our staff, or our families for simply doing our patriotic duty. But in addition to that, it makes it a lot harder for us to do that duty. It takes us away from the actual work of administering elections every time we need to issue protections or think about our own safety. So I think, and I could say, speaking with our election workers, having a very clear statement in the law that it is not okay, that it is a crime to threaten us in our workplace for simply just doing the job of making elections work for everyone is long overdue to see that federal legislation passed. And I can say with experience of passing similar legislation in Michigan, it goes a long way to send a message that type of behavior is not approved or appropriate in our state.
Mr. Kramer, what do you think? What's the impact on election administration when there are threats and intimidation of election workers, which, as we saw in 2020, we saw in Georgia? In fact, I would note, Madam Chair, the Republican election officials in Georgia were begging in public that the former president cease spreading baseless conspiracy theories about the theft of the election in Georgia because it put lives at risk. What's the impact, Mr. Kramer, on the capacity of election workers to do their jobs when they face those kinds of threats and when those threats are based upon baseless conspiracies about election fraud?
It's keeping the good people still running elections for this country. In South Carolina, we're losing a wealth of knowledge, hardworking professional men and women who serve this country by performing this duty, and they're leaving. And that wealth of knowledge leaving is a bad thing for the United States. These are people who swear to uphold the Constitution of the state and of the United States. So no, it is a bad thing, and it's one thing that I actually, when asked what keeps me up at night, it's the protection of these workers. And when they wake up in the morning and they get a threat to their safety, That concerns me. It should concern everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Ms. Nelson, in Georgia, in the aftermath of the 2020 election. By the way, I want to note there's a lengthy op-ed that was written by a guy named Ken Block. He was hired by the Trump campaign to find fraud in Georgia, found none, wrote a lengthy editorial about how he found none and the impact of these conspiracy theories. Nevertheless, on the basis of those conspiracy theories, the Georgia state legislature passed a law that, for example, cuts the available time for runoff elections in half, driving up wait times in runoff elections. What's the impact of that kind of policy on ensuring access to the ballot for all eligible voters?
Well, Georgia passed a very harmful omnibus voter suppression law, and what it does is exacerbates the issues that black voters in particular face, like long lines. We know that Georgia has a very, very horrible reputation for disproportionate lines that black voters face, and we know that part of their law attempted to actually prevent people from providing basic sustenance to those people who have to wait on disproportionately long lines, like water and snacks. We were fortunate enough to be able to beat back part of that law and some of the other aspects of that law that would have disenfranchised many black voters. But good portions of that law still exist, and we know that we have to redouble our efforts in order to have a fair shot at casting a ballot in the upcoming elections.
I believe the research is 6 times longer waiting in line for black voters in Georgia. Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Butler.
The gift of being number 100.
I'll remember that time you went first on this committee.
A total gift.
Time.
That's why I said it works in all kinds of ways, and particularly depending on your chair. So definitely appreciate you all for your testimony and for being here. Ms. Nelson, if you wouldn't mind, would love to start with you. You submitted in your written testimony the challenges that the LDF sort of was facing and working with in Hinds County, Mississippi, Jackson. In particular, I think there was some specific data that you shared in that written testimony, saying that Hinds County is approximately 70% black, experienced extensive ballot shortages during the 2023 Mississippi statewide election. Now, this was one of the first times in my recent memory as a Mississippian that there was a competitive governor's race. And there was an opportunity for Mississippi to elect their first Democratic governor in, very long time. But your written testimony also noted that there were up to nine polling locations in Hinds County that ran out of ballots multiple times during Election Day, some of them before 12 noon. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that LDF was a part of some investigative work and steps to help to find out in Hinds County what went wrong in efforts to offer those learnings to others, advocacy organizations across the state and across the country and those who are doing that work. Can you just share with the committee quickly what you learned from the investigation of what happened in Hinds County?
Sure, some of it is still ongoing, and in fact, I mentioned the elections in Mississippi today, and unfortunately, we did not get an answer before today's election as to whether there was any threat of ballots running out again based on what we learned in the previous election. So we're still investigating that. That's why we have people on the ground, and that's why we are documenting in a new report, Democracy Defended, all of the different incursions on the right to vote that we're finding, so that there's a record that can support the federal legislation that we're here to demand Congress pass. The suggestion that there are no modern conditions that should give rise to federal intervention is just patently false. And the work that we do, along with our civil rights colleagues, every election on the ground establishes that record to support federal legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Mr. Allen, I actually had the pleasure of being down in Alabama just a week ago. And being on the campus of Alabama State University, as a member of this body, conducting a field hearing in Alabama, talking to Alabama voters about just that point, the modern discrimination that Alabamans are experiencing and that we're seeing happen across the country. I would like to actually, instead of landing there, you said something in your testimony just a few minutes ago in response to an earlier question that I would love to just press on just a little bit to understand more. You made mention of some HAVA funds. You said that your office uses to get mapping software for counties and municipalities. Am I capturing that accurately?
It's for the county boards of registrars.
So that's that's really helpful because I noted that just earlier this month, there's 6,000 voters in Alabama's newly drawn 2nd congressional district that received election postcards listing incorrect voter information. I appreciate that your office has said before that you weren't involved in sending out those postcards. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection between the challenges of Alabama voters not getting the correct information, the tools that you say that your office helps to provide and facilitate for county elections, and why you think that your office had nothing to do with voters in Alabama getting the incorrect information for their polling location?
Sure, it is the boards of registrars in every county to make sure that the voters are placed in the correct district. It is not the secretary's role or the secretary's office role to conduct any of the voter assignments. That is solely left up to the county. All the Southern Poverty Law Center had to do was to place a phone call to us, and we could have made sure we got on the telephone with the county in question to make sure we got it right. But instead, what they chose to do was to send out a press release at Monday afternoon before the primary, which introduced confusion and introduced chaos right before the primary election. And, it was something that wasn't appreciated by my office. Open communication would have been best for the day to do that, but it was on Montgomery County and those boards of registrars to make sure they had those voters in the correct district and make sure that everyone was in the correct precinct. And everyone that voted on Election Day got the correct ballot. I want everybody to understand that. They got the correct ballot to vote in Congressional District 2.
Thank you, Secretary Allen. I find it interesting, and I know there's another senator waiting. I find it interesting that the response goes to what an advocacy group was doing or not doing, and in Alabama, in SB 1, those very same advocacy groups are prohibited from actually helping people get information that they need. So I find that an interesting contradiction, but thank you. I yield my time, Chairwoman.
Okay, Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing, and to all of you, thank you for your willingness to be here today to testify. Secretary Benson, I had a couple questions for you, if that's okay. We heard yesterday on the Intelligence Committee from leaders of the intelligence community the not very surprising news about the continuing threat that social media platforms pose to our democracy. Every single one of these platforms, I think, virtually has been used to spread education-related disinformation, not just here, but all around the world, sometimes to violent and deadly effect. In the lead up to the 2022 elections, online mentions of voter fraud just absolutely skyrocketed. In 2020, we saw our fellow citizens storm the Capitol, which is well known to save an election that had not been stolen. Their rage amplified by relentless algorithms that were engineered really for profit to sell advertising, not for the sake of our democracy, certainly. In 2016, it's well established this is not a political view that Vladimir Putin interfered with our election, as he has repeatedly with elections in other countries around the world, here playing both sides of every single issue with 10 million tweets. That's not an exaggeration, to quote Joe Biden. That is the reality of what was happening there. And I think, there's a lot going on, as the chair knows, today on TikTok in the Capitol. I don't want to get distracted by that today, except to say probably good things are not going to happen if one of the sources of major information in terms of our electoral process is coming from a platform that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. One can imagine that that's going to be end in a bad way for the United States. And I think it would be really self-defeating of us to assume that what happened in 2022 and in 2020 and in 2016 isn't going to happen again this year. You've stated that misinformation is the top concern in 2024, even more than in 2020. Could you talk a little bit about what national standards you think we ought to be able to put in place to help safeguard our elections from online influence campaigns?
Thank you, Senator. And yes, we've been working in Michigan to emphasize that there's a greater incentive than ever before for foreign actors to interfere with our elections, and the mechanism through which they will interfere is through trying to deceive our voters. And particularly with this being the first election in which artificial intelligence is on the rise as an evolving threat, we believe that will be one of the more likely tactics that they utilize, particularly through social media and elsewhere. So I do think first and foremost for the Senate to pass the Senator Klobuchar bill against deceptive practices with AI will be key to helping every state be prepared. We have state legislation. We're one of 6 states that have passed state legislation to that effect. But secondly, I would argue that as I often say, democracy is a team sport, and these statements saying what is okay and what is not, what is illegal and what is not with regards to deception in elections is one piece, but it is not the whole piece of the puzzle. We also have to equip trusted voices, faith leaders, business leaders, community leaders, labor leaders, and many others, which we're doing in our state, and I think we need to do nationwide, and I think every senator could be a convener of these trusted voices to equip them with truthful information about our elections, help us to get that out ahead of the misinformation hitting our states, and that will help us to ensure voters don't get fooled because they've already been educated ahead of time about the truth in our elections and where to get trusted information if they need more.
If I've got 1 minute left, could I ask one more question quickly, Madam Chair? Is that all right? Thank you. Next week, as you know, and the Supreme Court is going to hear the case of Murphy against Missouri, which addresses a district court decision preventing the federal government from communicating with social media companies about the content on their sites. This decision, the lower court decision, has had a disastrous effect on our ability to combat foreign influence operations and protect the integrity of our elections. It affects the government's ability to coordinate with the platforms, on public health information. It threatens to undermine the efforts undertaken across multiple presidential administrations to hold the platforms accountable for their own, to have their own sets of policies. The Washington Post just reported that the federal government has basically stopped warning some platforms about foreign disinformation campaigns altogether as a result of that. Legal experts have called the injunction strikingly broad. They've pointed to flaws in its logic, its confused legal arguments, and the alarming conclusions it draws about the federal government's role to play. I just wonder how you're navigating these challenges in this changing legal environment when it comes to communicating with platforms and the clear and present danger to Michigan's elections.
It's difficult, and certainly the court ruling makes it a lot more challenging to collaborate with social media companies that have an important role to play in protecting their users from deceptive tactics and misinformation. So we'll be eagerly awaiting the outcome of that particular case, but in the interim, working with citizens to help them become critical consumers of the information they do receive, helping them understand the way in which the misinformation causes chaos and confusion and disruption to our elections has been our focus, so that we can empower the citizens in our state to spot the deep fakes, to spot people trying to fool them, to spot the bad information on social media, and not only not send it or forward it, but instead respond with truthful information to help us counter that in every way in our state.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to everybody on the panel.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, all our witnesses, for a very good hearing. I'm grateful to the election officials here today and for your work to ensure elections are administered securely and safely. I also want to thank Ms. Nelson for her continued work to ensure equal access on the ballot. And I look forward to continuing our work on this committee to support election officials and protect our free and fair elections. The hearing record will remain open for 1 week. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.